and welcome to the Ideas Factory. This week saw severe protests across many states in America over the killing of African-American George Floyd in police custody. Black Lives Matter has been reverberating on the streets of America and now has crossed the Atlantic, and it can also be heard in Europe. And all this while the country as well as the world is still grappling with COVID-19 and its after effects. The GDP and the economy has been a collateral damage of this COVID-19. But all this is not stopping or does not deter China from increasing tension at the Indian border. So all this today on this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma, and joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. Harsh, I would like to start with what's happening in America. Black Lives Matter took to the streets and also online. It has now crossed the Atlantic. In the streets of Europe also are reverberating with the slogan of Black Lives Matter. But all this couldn't have come at a more critical time for the US when the country is dealing with COVID-19 and the political class is preparing for the elections, for the national elections. So how do you assess the political implication for the US as well as the emerging model around the world?
Well, I think, it seems as if we are hurtling from, America is hurtling from one crisis to another, almost on an everyday basis. And I think this episode, this crisis could not have come at a worse time. There is a larger issue here about race relations, which have always bedeviled American politics. Let's be honest, despite Mr. Obama becoming the president of the US, the race relations have continued to be very, very complicated. And especially, I think the relationship between the police, the way policing is done, and the state of African Americans has been a persistent problem. Persistent questions have arisen in this regard, and successive administrations have dealt with in very different ways. Now, I think what has happened, it seems that for Mr. Trump, this comes at a particularly problematic time because there are lots, there are questions about his governance abilities, which then, merge into this larger problem. So from coronavirus, the whole epidemic and how he handled it, he has, as we have been discussing, he has been trying to deflect attention on outsiders, China in particular, becomes an easy scapegoat because of his own problems at home. And now here comes a purely domestic crisis. It would be very difficult for even sort of an information manipulator like Mr. Trump to manipulate this larger issue and to sort of leave it at someone else's doorstep. So it seems to me that for him, it would be very important to get the narrative right. And already it's very strange. The polarization in American society is so extreme that even on race relations, you are actually seeing two very different kinds of narratives emerging about domestic politics. On the one hand, you have how do you interpret this in terms of the presidential elections? There are those who are saying, well, look, this is going to be a major problem for Mr. Trump. He can't really get off making an argument around it, and therefore it will impact him negatively. And there are those who are arguing, well, it's not entirely clear. It's perhaps possible for him to get his base again rallying around a certain issue. And he can always argue, and he has been arguing that he has done more for African Americans, oftentimes providing statistics which are problematic. But he can argue that, look, I have done so much. I have provided, if you look at their employment figures, if you look at incarceration rates, all of that, one can make an argument that probably under his administration, things have not been that bad. But optics are clearly problematic, and he will have to navigate this terrain. And it's not entirely clear to me that it would be an easy ride for him, given that his presumptive adversary, Joe Biden, already enjoys a lead over him when it comes to African Americans, and we have seen that consolidation happening. So we will, it would be very interesting to see how he handles it, and we already see some of the negative backlash coming out. For example, he's going to the church, the imagery around that, the way he quelled the protesters, and then he went solo to the church, and then now he's saying because the unemployment figures are low, perhaps Mr. George Floyd would be very happy. So in that sense, he has tried to manipulate that information that is coming his way. But I don't think it's a straight trajectory from here to the November elections. And I'm sure multiple crises are looming both for America and for the Trump presidency at large.
Yes, going to the church. And now to see the optics, going to the church and holding the Bible upside down, and was accused that it was probably Ivanka Trump's idea, who carried that very Bible in her very expensive Max Mara bag. So all these details came up, and he's been accused of putting America almost on the brink of a civil war, Harsh. But he's accused of making a bad situation so much worse. He's speaking a very authoritarian language. He says when the looting starts, the shooting starts. But still, this election year does not yet come with an absolute hope for Joe Biden. How do you see his chances?
See, I think it's still very open because, yes, you are right that, Mr. Trump is known for certain things, but he's also known for making the best out of worse situations. So, he has been in very bad situations, and he has emerged victorious, as we know, in the past as well. So in this sense, I think, there is an attempt here, the imagery, they're going to church, using, employment figures, all of that in some ways, he's trying to rally his base, which is basically the Rust Belt, white Americans, and saying that, look, I am like you, although he is nothing like them, but he has been conveying them, and his followers are willing to buy that narrative. For a long time, we have seen all his gaffes, all his problems have been excused. His base continues to rally around him. The polling numbers that we have seen tell us that nothing much has changed substantially. And for Mr. Biden to make a dent in his base is also very, very problematic, although he's seen as, again, the reason he has been nominated by the Democrats is because he carries a certain weight in the Rust Belt. He carries a certain weight with what are called as the white voters in certain constituencies, key constituencies. But I don't think it's going to be straightforward with Mr. Biden. He himself is facing problems, and therefore Mr. Trump can very well rally this around and turn this around and say that my base remains intact and my base needs to rally behind me, and the other side can be disjointed, may not rally around Mr. Biden, and that way he still scores points over Mr. Biden. So I think, again, as I said, I think it's too early to predict, but clearly there is a large load here till November elections, and it will be very, very fascinating to see who is able to get a control over the narrative that is emerging in America today. Because look, what he has also done is he has said that look, these are anarchists. So in a sense, and extreme left. So what he's saying is that for the right, it's very important to rally around me because the radical left is coming. And so in that sense also, he has sharpened the cleavages. He has sharpened the debate in America. And therefore, he hopes that polarization would help him. We will see.
Yeah, where he's trying to, yes, like you said, that he's trying to say that the radical left is here, so the right has to rally around him, and these are looters, and which is why he says that when the looting starts, the shooting starts, all of that. So these are his domestic problems. He was already blaming all wrong on China, and now he's found this, which, like you say, he may turn it upside down and use it to his advantage. But how does it really reflect upon, if we look at the emerging world order, or in terms of America's relations or America's leadership role in the world? They already had a problem with China, which is going on. But dealing with all these domestic problems, on the brink of a civil war, facing an election, how do you see America in this emerging world order?
I think, again, it's very critical time for America, because the whole idea of America and the attraction for America that is there in the world as a beacon of freedom, as a beacon of hope, as a country where everything is possible, where you can have, you can just go and make your mark irrespective of where you come from. That idea has been very attractive. America is a superpower not simply because of its material capabilities, but because of the ideas, that it has been able to, generate and rally the world around. And those ideas are under threat today. And therefore, for Mr. Trump, if the whole for the last few weeks and months we have been discussing the China factor and how he has been getting tough on China and making democracy a rallying cry, right? What do you talk about when it comes to Taiwan? Taiwan is an important partner for America because of the value systems. What do you do when it comes to when China is tightening screws in Hong Kong? You say, well, we will not accept the basing or the removal of freedoms that were enshrined in that agreement with the United Kingdom. So clearly, when the more America talks about these values, the more focus there will be on American conduct itself. And I think right now, when you look at America, when you look at the crisis, when you look at the whole model, which has been, for a long time, it was considered to be the most efficient model. With all its problems, it was the best that we had. An American system, when the going gets tough, Americans, they get going. That was, the argument was that America gets it right in the end. Now we see a certain pattern where things are becoming very difficult. For the marginalized, for the poor, for the underprivileged, it does not look to be a very appealing place, and that puts another model, the Chinese model, into contention. The Chinese will, and they've already said, if you look at the Chinese media, that's what they've been talking about. What is happening in America, the lack of governance, the lack of political initiative, the lack of effort by the Americans in solving their own problems. And here they lecture us. That's what the Chinese say. So Chinese are basically questioning America's ability to, to set the global agenda on certain norms. And that is where I think the danger lies, because if you do not have a competent leader who can rally the world around certain normative values, then in a sense, Chinese values would look very appealing to many countries, as they have already, as we have already talked about, and the world knows. And I think that makes it very problematic for those of us, or for those countries who believe in a different set of values to the Chinese, to actually make our values more potent and to make them the rallying cry for the world. And I think that's the challenge for America, and that's the challenge for those who believe that American model is a better model.
Yes, like you said, Chinese are trying to set the global agenda, and China is accusing America of lack of leadership and this chaos, utter chaos that is there on the streets of America. But most of the countries also seem to be very wary of China, of their predatory practices, trade practices especially. And in the middle of all this, the way China has opened up many fronts with many neighbors. For example, look at India, the border tension at the LAC, for which we're having a top-level military engagement today as we speak. It is a very bad time for ratcheting up tension, but then this Indo-China tension has been simmering. This is not the first time that this is happening, because the LAC was never clearly demarcated. That's one view. But what is different this time? This has happened before, the Tumor, Doklam. There are many instances. What really, this is, looked upon as one of the most serious problems or face-offs that we are now facing. So what is different this time?
I think, there are a couple of things. One, operationally or tactically at the local level, what is different is that we have seen sudden ramping up of pressure. We used to have transgressions across the border. Transgressions in limited number of Chinese soldiers would come this side, or limited number of Indian soldiers might go that side, and there'd be some scuffles, and then they would sort of restore the status quo ante. I think this time, the way the numbers have been ramped up, the way military logistics have been ramped up, that I think tells you that both sides perhaps are willing to look at it in a longer term context, that they are willing to dig in for the long haul. And we will see, for example, what these talks generate and how these talks go forward. Because again, this is unprecedented. In the past, we used to have local level commanders talking to each other. Today, now we have ratcheted up. We are now asking Lieutenant General level of military leadership to take cognizance of the matter, which itself tells us that there is a seriousness behind what is happening at the border. And I think, but again, by and large, if you see the diplomatic communique that came out yesterday, both sides also have been constantly making a case to the wider world and to their own domestic populations that they are aware of the challenges and they would like them to be controlled. They would be dealt with in a controlled manner. Now, what I think has happened this time, and which is interesting, that often Indian foreign policy or Indian security policy has been reacting to what the Chinese have been doing. Now, this crisis, to me, it seems for the first time, Chinese are also reacting to what India has done. And that is a reaction to last year's, for example, if you go back to August last year, when India sort of bifurcated Jammu and Kashmir into two union territories, redrew the maps, in the maps, there was a clear idea, and the Indian Home Minister spoke about Aksai Chin as well, Gilgit-Baltistan as well. So there is a larger attempt to consolidate the periphery, if you will. And I think that has resulted in a lot of consternation in the Chinese side for obvious reasons, because the kind of stakes they have built in Pakistan and in contested territories, certainly it would mean that the Chinese will have to take cognizance of that immediately. And so in some ways, what is happening today at the border, in particular in a certain sector of the border, which is Ladakh, I think tells you that the challenges are going to change when it comes to the border. We have always had this narrative that, look, LAC is the longest undemarcated boundary in the world. There is back and forth between the two sides. It's not clearly demarcated. Therefore, we really don't know. There are differences of perception, as they are called. And therefore, some transgressions happen here and there. Some local level conflict happens, or even skirmishes happen, and we manage it. But I think this time there is a seriousness to it, because the larger frame of reference has changed. As far as India is concerned, India is also signaling that it is serious about consolidation of its periphery, in the same way that the Chinese have been signaling to India that when it comes to Chinese periphery, they are very, very, they are not willing to budge an inch. So I think when you have these two powers really rallying up and really looking each other in the eye, this is what you get. And one hopes that this gets resolved diplomatically, or at least at the military level talks that are now beginning to happen.
Yes, last time there was a crisis. For example, we look at Doklam, it took many rounds of meeting, and at the meeting at the summit meeting at Wuhan. But this meeting that's happening at the military level, along with that, we've also had many diplomatic exchanges. There's a joint secretary level dialogue that happened, but it's also happening at a time when all this is basically happening. A lot of it is happening virtually, and it will require probably many more meetings, because we know that to melt the ice, a one-on-one meeting, backdoor diplomacy, and a lot of things are needed. So how do you see this? And with this, I would also come to the virtual summit that happened between India and Australia. But these virtual diplomacy in a situation like this, how effective would that be?
I think when we already have a certain level of convergence and comfort level with our interlocutors, virtual meetings can be as good as real meetings. I mean, you don't really, one can save a lot of resources by doing virtual meetings. And I think the second part of your question, the India-Australia bit, is a good example of that. There is already a great amount of convergence, great degree of convergence, and we are just trying to build on that. So I think it can happen more often, it can happen more regularly, and it sort of builds on that underlying structure of convergence. But I think with India-China, and that again poses a problem, that you have fundamental issues that need to be tackled. And there are such divergent approaches, such divergent views on even the basics of this problem, that virtual meetings really will not be able to, push the momentum forward. And I think that is what perhaps is a bit worrying at this juncture, because we do need more face-to-face engagement. We do need more greater level of the two sides really coming to terms with each other personally. Interpersonal engagement is needed. And that perhaps, again, will be very difficult given the circumstances. So we are doing what perhaps is the best under the circumstances. But I think the larger question about virtual meetings, virtual engagement is best when you already are converging on a range of issues. When you are diverging, then it's best to meet face-to-face and thrash it out, which again, it will be difficult for some time, but one hopes that as things become normal, not only the local level commanders, not only some of the senior military officials, but also the top level leaders can engage in face-to-face diplomacy, which will, I think, at the end be very crucial when it comes to dealing with such knotty issues like India and China and Sino-Indian boundary issue.
Absolutely. So at the most, with the talks that are going on, probably there'll be many more meetings, and what India would expect is to actually restore the status quo as of now. But we'll have to see, and this will require probably many more meetings, and not just one meeting would be enough. But the world seems right now to be in a very volatile kind of a situation if you look at what's happening in America and at the India-China border. But we have time for only this much today in this episode of Ideas Factory. Thank you very much for this conversation, Harsh.
Thank you, Naghma.